Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the second of our two seminar series on the crisis in Venezuela, which is entitled Toward a Venezuelan Transition, Escaping a Complex Humanitarian Emergency. Before we start, I'd like to thank our outstanding team at Dr. Class, especially Jimena Colina, for making this event happen. Thanks also to our co-sponsor, the Harvard Growth Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. And most importantly, thanks to José Ignacio Hernández, professor of law at the Andrés Bello Catholic University and a fellow at the Harvard Growth Lab. José Ignacio created and designed and made this seminar happen, and he'll be co-moderating the event with me. As everybody in attendance surely knows, the Venezuelan situation has evolved from a full-blown dictatorship and an economic crisis 7 or 8 years ago into a humanitarian crisis almost without parallel in South American history. The economy contracted by more than 70% between 2013 and 2020, which is one of the steepest declines in the history of the modern world. Inflation may have reached 1,000,000% a couple of years ago, but it's been in hyperinflation now for many years. The state itself is gradually collapsing. And of course, the situation has been made worse by the pandemic. So Venezuela has literally become unlivable. More than 5 million Venezuelans have now fled the country, in an almost unimaginable number. And yet, to the surprise of many observers, most of them, I think, the Maduro government clings to power. So this is part of a two-part seminar or series that aims to think a little bit about how to escape this unparalleled humanitarian crisis. And before I introduce our two terrific speakers, just a couple of housekeeping rules. First of all, the speakers will be in both English and Spanish. I think both of our speakers will be in Spanish, but we have Spanish and English translation available for all. Just go to the interpretation function on Zoom and you can get the translation that you need. The event also is being recorded. It will eventually be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel. Our presenters will each speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, after which we'll have a period of question and answer. You can submit questions at any time during the talks via the Q&A function in Zoom. So you could do it at the end or at any point during the session. Feel free to submit a question, and José Ignacio and I will feed the questions to our speakers. Okay, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, and we will go, they'll speak in this order. First of all, Luis Almagro. Almagro is General Secretary of the Organization of American States, OAS. He is a lawyer by training with a long-standing commitment to the defense of human rights and democracy in the region. Secretary Almagro spent 23 years working in the Uruguayan Foreign Ministry. From 2007 to 2010, he was ambassador to China, Uruguay's ambassador to China. From 2010 to 2015, he served as foreign minister in the government of President José Mujica. And in 2015, he was elected General Secretary of the OAS on a platform of, and I quote, more rights for more people. He was reelected to the position last year. It has not been an easy 6 years. I do not envy him. Secretary Almagro has had to devote much of his time and energy to the Venezuelan tragedy, which gives him, I think, a lot of insights to share today. He will speak first. He'll be followed by María Gabriela Ponce, who's professor and researcher at the Economic and Social Research Institute at the Andrés Bello Catholic University in Venezuela. A sociologist by training, Professor Ponce specializes in the area of poverty, which unfortunately has become an extraordinarily important issue in Venezuela. Among many other works, she's co-author of Poverty and Social Expenditure in the Venezuela of the Bolivarian Republic, published about 5 years ago. Professor Ponce is also a member of the research team of the National Survey of Living Conditions in COVID, the leading survey that measures Venezuelan and social and economic conditions. Again, that's important in every state, but of extraordinary importance in Venezuela today. So let me step aside and hand the microphone to Secretary Almagro. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you here, sir.
Thank you very much for this invitation and the opportunity to be with all of you. And it is relevant, the question about a transition in Venezuela. And I would like to switch to Spanish to achieve better clarity, I think, in what I want to expose. I mean, when we talk, cuando hablamos de una transición, tenemos que preguntarnos.
When we talk about transition, we need to know what type of transition, where to where, what to what, and this is a transition to democracy in the rule of law in Venezuela will overcome complexity of the third wave of the currency as we're seeing, and the magnitude of humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis, political crisis, economic, social crisis does not have any precedent in the hemisphere. It's a war without war. It's a war and repression, oppression over the Venezuelan people has continued without the Venezuelans to make their rights be respected. So how do we dismantle this repressive state? How do we dismantle a criminal state? How do we dismantle this systemic structure, the repressive intelligence, military, communitary repression? How do we unarm the armed groups? And there are no models in history to teach us to implement a transition in Venezuela. So there are principles, there are standards, there are systems internationally that could lead us to that. And there are rules, instruments, as the OAS Charter, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, the Rome statutes that give us a roadmap. So, and all the scaffolding of standards are the base for transition. And in this sense, the participation of the international community to escape from the humanitarian crisis is absolutely necessary. And that will imply a system of cooperation, international cooperation that will ensure conditions and in productive and economic stability, and also humanitarian crisis conditions to reestablish the public order. And that will be necessary so as to induce it through the international system. So for the member states of the OAS, and where they're focused on maintaining democracy, fundamental rights, and there are no borders when we talk about defense of human rights, or there are no borders to defend democracy. If this is not established, democracy is not an issue of jurisdiction. All states have the responsibility regarding the preservation of democracy. And this is systemic. This is something that has been installed in the Inter-American system. And the Article 1 of the Inter-American Charter establishes that people of the Americas have the right to democracy, and they have the right to defend democracy. This is essential for the social, political, and economic development of these countries, and defending democracy is key. It is a responsibility that goes beyond any border. It is a commitment of the member states of the OAS. They signed this to consolidate democracy at a regional level. Bolivar has established this in the first Pan-American meetings. Democracy is a system for the hemisphere, for the whole hemisphere. And in other states, they say, well, they could not The state cannot have an influence on or due to what happens in a house, for instance. The government says they cannot get into a domestic violence issue. No, there should be a guarantee and a protection of the rights of all individuals. So a comparison of this with the Venezuelan case means that we have the responsibility of action when there is a violation on human rights and a crisis, or when we have crimes against humanity. We need to act accordingly so as to generate the conditions for a democratic transition. We have an obligation of protecting the Venezuelan people. We have the obligation of protecting the rights of the Venezuelan people. And within these rights, we have the obligation of protecting democracy. This is a situation of a country of the variables, of criminal variables that are installed. And we have seen this in each and every case that has been judged internationally, that has been evaluated internationally in the country. We have the nephews of the first lady in jail, accused of drug trafficking, and we have drug trafficking in each and every corner of the institutionality, quote unquote, of the Venezuelan authorities. And we have cases of corruption. And in Houston, in Florida, of corruption of PDVSA. And also to see the dimension of corruption. The corruption of Odebrecht, 15 years, it's $800 million. And $800 million in commission. And also a case of PDVSA that is tried in Florida is $1.5 billion. So this is almost double the corruption that exists or that happened in Odebrecht for 15 years. So this is simply out of range. It's absolutely out of range. So estimation, lowest estimation is that $90 billion in corruption that has been stolen from Venezuela. This is way beyond the Marshall Plan in currency. So a transition process that we want to establish here is very long, and it has to overcome different phases, cultural of dismantling the structure, the criminal structure, also the dismantling the repressive apparatus that violates the rights of the people, of their people. We need to reestablish basic rights, basic needs, the right for food, health, public order that are necessary to reestablish in Venezuela. The right for a fair work, education, and housing. These are subjects that need to be solved from scratch in the current situation. Cooperation, international cooperation will be key. It will be key to recover the funds of corruption of the regime, and it will be key to reestablish the best conditions, humanitarian conditions in the people of Venezuela. Now, the relationship of the regime after they leave the outgoing regime, well, this is key for any process, the effort on the reestablishment of democratic reestablishment. These are the principles, with the principles of justice, memory, truth, and non-repetition. And these are key concepts. These are fundamental concepts. So definitely the variables that lead to that imply that we need to have these principles in mind. Crimes against humanity, they are they do not prescribe, and they are installed in the repressive criminal logic, and we should have justice. We need to look for truth in each of the area of the regime, the link with the drug trafficking, with the drug dealers, and with the hosting terrorist organizations, ELN, or up in FARC, and even Hezbollah. So we need to point this out, and we need to work. This will be tough in work. It will be hard, and having the best conditions so as to generate that need for justice, which is absolutely necessary. As with all ideologic schemes, we will have people, we hopefully have a space that could be used for the best people possible, so we can to rebuild the country. We need the best electoral rules. The way out is democracy. That is the only one. That is the only. So through the elections has sometimes it has led an adequate election might lead that government to disestablish the democratic establishment of the country. But to reestablish that, we need to trust democracy. We need to trust democracy to bring that back. So that is what we need. We need people to express themselves. And that implies changing the rules, changing the electoral rules in Venezuela.
Country continues to experience a deficit of justice along with an absence of respect for human rights and democracy. As of today, the regime is conducting elections that are not transparent, fair, just at all. They don't have an impartial electoral authority, and they don't have minimum standards to guarantee that they will be fair and free. The country urgently needs electoral and political reform. All political actors and civil society must be included in this process in order to have a permanent and stable legal and also the administrative framework that has the confidence of all actors. New election rules must be clear and their application transparent and consistent to prevent any discretion in their application. We believe that the following are some of the essential measures that must be taken in order to guarantee free and fair elections. These are basic principles based on the experience of the Organization of American States observing elections in the hemisphere. A new electoral authority must be established, and independent and impartial arbiter is an essential condition for free and fair elections. Once this happens, representatives of political organizations must be encouraged to participate actively in the work of the electoral branch in order to build greater levels of trust in authority. This work should be done district by district. There should be new people performing the electoral work in each one of the 14,000 voting places. There must be clear procedures for their creation, operation, participation, internal democracy, and access to financing of political parties. Mechanisms to guarantee equitable and transparent access to the media for parties and candidates must be defined. The law must allow the participation of national election observation organizations, of international observation too. They are essential actors in providing transparency and building trust among those involved in the process. The electoral registry must be done again, and protocols must be put in place for its administration, auditing, and publication. Mechanisms to assure that people can vote abroad are necessary, that citizens must be given valid documents within and out of the country, A clear system of electoral dispute resolution must be put in place. Political parties and citizens must be allowed to challenge the different actions and resolutions of the electoral bodies. Decisions adopted at the different level must also be publicized and accessible so that people know the reason and motivations behind a given decision and see the evidence used to accept or dismiss any challenges made. Electoral procedures must be transparent, clearly regulated, and not subject to last-minute change, as has been the case in the past. Human rights, that is basic need. The whole political system has to change. We have to free all the political prisoners, guarantee freedom of expression, freedom of association, meeting. In addition to having electoral reform, there must be an end to repression and restoration of human rights. The government of Venezuela has shown an ongoing pattern of effort designed to curtail the rights of its citizens at the basic level. This includes ongoing harassment and intimidation, restrictions to political rights, violation of the freedom of the press and the freedom of expression, inhumane treatment, and arbitrary detentions. The government needs to allow the return of the mechanism to preserve human rights, like the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the follow-up mechanism of Venezuela, and of course the work of United Nations. Definitely, we need a different approach, a completely different approach in the political equation. It cannot be the one that we have had so far. Es una reconstrucción completa prácticamente.
This is a full reconstruction. This is a full reconstruction of the electoral system. So therefore, and finally, reconstruction of the state needs to start from scratch, from zero. Transition is not even full. This is not sufficient. The institutionality of Venezuela has no capacity of solving any issue whatsoever, internal issue whatsoever in Venezuela. They cannot solve an issue of security because institutionality doesn't have the capacity of doing so. Cannot solve the issue of health because institutionality cannot do so. Productive issues, they don't have capacity to solve any productive issues. And we can continue naming all these fundamental issues, economic, social, cultural, political, civilian, from the Venezuelan people. So therefore, we would need to recycle all the authoritarian power. 20,000 Cubans, 23, 25,000, sometimes it's 18,000 Cubans in there. They are that authoritarian power exercised by the Cubans there with the foreign nationals and the participation of terrorist organizations as the ones that I have mentioned initially. So fundamentally, this is part of the work. It is necessary to unify the international agenda. It is necessary to, well, today the agenda, the dictatorship inside has established agreements, partial agreements with different political groups based on the different situations or the needs of each of the parties. They have authorized all schemes, corruption, repression, intimidation, or forcing exile. Each of them has a logic, that has done what the dictatorship has done to the outside. They promise different things. That's why we have so many people in that same issue, so many people doing pressure on this side, escapes on the other side. So there should be a clear, unified agenda. The US, EU, Norway, the Inter-American system, the universal system of the United Nations, as well as other powers that could have an eventual interest in Venezuela. All actors, international actors, should have the same objective. And this is internally more difficult because the level of pressure, threat, political pressure, infiltration, dictatorial infiltration generate very large difficulties. And our recognition, without a doubt, to the work that has been done by President in charge, Juan Guaido, without resources, without means, supporting, only with the support on paper that he has faced dictatorship with great determination. Thank you so much for that possibility and for allowing me to make this presentation.
Thank you, Secretary. Now we offer the floor to Professor María Gabriela Ponce. Are you there, María Gabriela? I'm sharing the screen. While I share my screen, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the invitation. I am honored by the possibility of being together with Secretary Almagro, and he has done so much for our country moderators, the university, and the attendees that are with us. What the work that I will be doing is about the social situation of Venezuela through the survey of life conditions that we call ENCOVI. And you will hear us ENCOVI from now on, the survey. And it's a survey that has been conducted since 2014 by the national universities, and with a non-very democratic characteristic that has to do with a lack of information. Venezuela was going since 2014 through a severe crisis where we already have previous information. At that time, we didn't have the possibility to have a representative information in order to know how Venezuelans were coping with this crisis. So we did the first edition in 2014. And now we have 6 editions. And I will introduce the results, although we have certain historical results of the last editions of ENCOVI, the survey, that somehow has the final part of the lockdown. So the results that we will be seeing are before the COVID crisis, and therefore I will only introduce some additional data, but the impact of COVID is not reflected in this survey, unfortunately. Now, let's begin. Once we have the ENCOVI, would like to go to the next slide, if it's possible. Please give me 1 second. Now we are there. The first thing that I would like to tell you is that in Venezuela, all this change has brought about an important change of the age and gender structure. In other words, what we call a new demographic. And the source of this data is not in COVID, and is the last review of the United Nations through the Latin American Center of Demographic Studies that is called ELADE. As you can notice in the first chart, you see the population forecast. Supposedly for 2020-21, we would be about 33 million. But notice that we will be below that figure. We won't even reach 29 million citizens. There is a difference, therefore, between what we have the official projection and still is in regards to these updating. That has to do with a combination of several factors. One is the migration. We have, according to the International Organizations of United Nations, for 2019, of 5 million Venezuelans that have left the country. And there is lesser production, less birth, and increase of mortality, especially in young people, male especially. And that is also impacts, as we will notice, in terms of the life expectancy. The fact is that when we see the projection of INE vis-a-vis the United Nations projection, we see that the difference are accounted in the productive ages. Therefore, that have implied for Venezuela is the acceleration of an aging process of the population for which we are not prepared. And furthermore, there is an increase of the relationship of demographic dependence. In other words, we will see an increase of the people that depend on those that are potentially active within the labor market. The crisis also ended up with the window of opportunity that meant the demographic bonus. And that is the moment where the countries have a much more active population as compared to those that depend on them. And there was a window of opportunity because it depends how the countries can use that. Supposedly, we would have that demographic bonus until 2045. But in 5 years, we lost almost 3 decades. So we're already entering in the stage of aging of the population. And that is, what else can we notice? We have an important drop in survival. The rate of infant mortality, as you know, it is a very well-known indicator so as to capture the condition is quite vulnerable to the conditions of the healthcare system and the surrounding, because it is a highly preventable mortality. So that went back to the levels that we have in the midst of 1985 and during the 90s. Now the estimation is 26,000 per 100,000 alive. In terms of 12, that was the initial estimation. Also, we have an important drop in terms of life expectancy in the period 2015-2020. And the drop has been 3.5 years less. Of course, with an important difference in terms of gender. We see that males 4.3 and women 2.6. And that is, among other things, has to do with the biological logic, but also social and violence logic that especially is seen in young men. And that has been increased the mortality in case of the males. Also, through ENCOVI, we have been able to capture important increase of women's in charge of the household. Since 2011, the household were in charge of 39%. In ENCOVI, now we're seeing that incidence increase almost to 60% of women as a household heads. And there are several hypotheses that has to do with migration. And the migration of men has been bigger than as compared to women, and also has to do with the aging and the bigger life expectancy in women. That is a data that also means a lot due to the type of demand that generates. But we have to compare that. As I said, in terms of life expectancy, we have lost in 5 years, almost 4 years. And in order to put this into a context, can be compared with the cases of the Democratic Republic of Korea in the 90s or Kenya, countries that experienced famine and civil war, and as a consequence, they suffer those impacts in life expectancy. So we have a reduction in the number of members of the households, and we are having currently more household with one person, and that has an implication because in Venezuela, the only institution, the standing institution is the family when people need to face any problem. And that also, that reduction, this new demography has implied a reduction of the potential demand and the decrease of the pressure on certain services. However, in spite of the fact that the pressure has decreased in the case of health, housing, public services. We haven't seen any improvement on that sphere. As to poverty, and here we see in the chart, we have a method. The first is the poverty line, or income poverty line that we call, where we have a comparison of income of the household vis-a-vis the cost of the food needs defined by the red line. So the income of the household are enough to buy or purchase the food, and the blue line is the general poverty. In other words, extreme poverty that includes those that cannot afford food. And non-extremes are those that still, when they can afford food, they cannot pay any other basic needs. So this is Venezuela, that, as you notice, has had an exponential growth of poverty. And basically, that has become a general issue to the whole population. So this type of method is the most sensitive method to the economic performance. And as you know, Venezuela is the country with the worst economic performance indicators at a worldwide level and regional level, according to several reports. The drop and the decrease of the GDP has been of 70%, and we are in a process of hyperinflation that is quite accelerated. And the incidence on poverty would put our country, Venezuela, as the poorest country in Latin America, even for the sake of the context, above Haiti, according to this indicator. So now, as you can see, the growth of poverty, of course, of this type of poverty has been given by the more severe component, the extreme poverty, that is a red line, that is growing accelerated since until 2018. It drops a little bit. We see that we have certain hypotheses why that happens, and that might be a transference policy that is called bonus by the government. But anyway, while poverty, we see 1.79% between 2014 and the last measurement. Extreme poverty has tripled. It has tripled 2.60 times as compared to the previous recording. As compared to 2013, it has grown 6 times. So it has increased 6 times. Not only we have become a country with more poverty, but also unequal. And here you have the calculation of inequality from income. Use the Gini index. You can see the measurements of Gini that was 0.4% before. Unfortunately, we're losing internet connection from María Gabriela. So it is very similar, and as a consequence of certain policies that strip certain favors to certain groups. Unfortunately, we're losing connection again, internet connection. And you can see the bars of the chart where we have the per capita income. And we can notice that those that improve are the 9 and 10 deciles, and the win or lose was reflected in the blue bars. And as always in the process, those that lose are the sectors, the low income sectors. They have a decrease in the case of the first deciles. The first 3, they have decrease in terms of relevance of almost 1/3 up to 60% of the total income. And this is what accounts for the increase of the Gini index. Also, we have detected, and that is a very important finding, changes in the makeup of the income of the households. While in Venezuela, traditionally, the income due to work accounted for 60 and 90% of the income of a household. Currently, that is accounted by 61% of the total income of households. And that has to do, is directly linked to the issue of the labor market crisis, low wages, etc. And that is related to the increase of other sources. I will show you the main three sources in the next slide, but so that you can have a broad idea in terms of wages. The minimum legal salary wage was about $6 in the reference month for these calculations was February of 2020, which meant $6 per month. It is far below the international poverty line. For instance, the World Bank, that is extreme poverty line, that is $1.9 per day. So that is the level that we have now. On the other hand, in more than 1.5 million households, 18% of the total households, the income completely depends on different sources to the work. And that means that most of the times to work can be more expensive than the remuneration that they perceive by the work. All the costs in terms of transportation to reach the labor place was much more expensive than not working at all. So we have the economically inactive population, which means that it's not a good business in all cases to work, and that had prevented the major chunk of the labor population to start working, and therefore they depend from other income sources. However, the lower deciles of the distribution, as you notice, are the ones that we have 1 and 2, the ones that have the biggest share of other income sources. Although we have less number of households receive this amount of money, the impact in the income, therefore, it is quite high. I'm trying to explain this with that chart. You have the main 3 income sources that are not related to labor. The blue lines are the remittances of money, and the red ones are pensions, retirement, or social security money. So if they have access to any type of pension or retirement, and the gray are bonuses and transfers from the government. So quickly, we have certain remarks in regards to this. You will notice that pensions and retirement, they receive as an average 40% of the household, but in the decile 1, they are received by the 13.19%, while in the upper segment is the one that receives more money, pensions and the retirement is the one that we have the decile 10th, the biggest one. From the 1 is the poorest and the 10th is the richest one. While only 9% of the household, they receive remittances of money, and transference accounts for more than half of the total income. So they account for 56% of the full income. While in decile number 10, 1 out of 4 households are receiving remittances, and the contribution to the income accounts for at least 15%. As to pensions and retirement, we see that they receive 40% of the household, but the difference also are quite large. In decile 1 only, they receive 13.8%, pensions and the retirement fees. While 19, that is the red dotted line, that is percentage of households that receive that money, they receive for almost 69%. Hence, the contribution of pensions and retirement increased so much for this segment. And I leave for the end the issue of bonuses and transference of the government that have been quite high, and they account for almost 1 out of 3 households that are receiving bonuses and transferences and remittances from the government. But as you notice, it's the one that has less variability in terms of the gray dotted line, which are the people that receive that. So almost all of them receive with between 30 and 36%, with the exceptions of the poorest decile. In the poorest one, they are received by 25%. However, when you see the contribution of the remittances and transfers in this decile, you see that that corresponds to 65% of income. Hence, we have an impact of this type of other non-labor sources. And the impact decreases if we follow the path of the gray bars. It decreases according to we move towards the richest deciles. So the impact of bonuses and the transference in terms of the lower income resource will have to do with the contribution of the household, with a clear attempt to focus on these sectors that are having problems because the reception is equal in decile 1. So this is not only an economic problem, it also goes against the economy of the households, and especially of the poorest segments, because the biggest contribution percentage to the income is a lot for those households, and they begin to generate dependence to issues that I will take again, I will mention again at the end. So we also use multidimensional poverty lines and measurements. And here we have the ECLAC proposal in 2014 that has 5 dimensions, 13 deprival indicators. And here we have all dimensions that have the same weight, with the exception of social protection and labor. And we have the life standards that has a double weight as compared to any other deprival, and social protection has half of the weight. So that for the household to be considered poor, there must be at least a 25% cut point. That means 4 deprivals or 2 deprival more plus income, because the income has a double weight. So this is how it has increased in the multi-dimension. And as I said, it measures the more severe poverty, because here we have several absences simultaneously. And since we have the component, there are structural components that are included within the indicators. Poverty grows in 25 points between 2014 and 2019, from which more than half happens in the last year, between 2018 and 2019. So here we have which are the main contributions, because this indicator allows us to know which are the main contributions of the 5 dimensions, and only we can see that the contribution of income has increased due to what we saw before, due to the extension of poverty in and low income in household, and because this is privation that has more contribution in this methodology. Since they are higher and since they have more weight, the contribution that is the highest in 2014, but that has increased in the last year. And we follow the level of importance of the services that, although they do not vary in terms of the contribution and to this indicator. Let's say that it has, in fact, a clear drop. And one of the major dramas that we have in Venezuela is the crisis of services. Only to tell you, give you a few information in Venezuela, in principle, between 1984 and 85% of the household had access to fresh water through pipes. But in 2019, COVID, that drops to 77%. The rationale is not that they destroyed the pipe system or sewage, but rather they declare that they do not receive fresh water through the pipes. And the question is in COVID, how? How are you receiving fresh water? And people are stopped declaring this through the pipes. And that is a way of looking at the crisis in that terms. And we also ask, due to the frequency of freshwater service, the household that receive on a daily basis between, in the census of 2011 and 2014, it remained about 63, 64, or 62%. But in 2019, that figure dropped to 24%, meaning that only 1 out of 4 households in Venezuela have fresh water on a daily basis in their houses. Imagine how we can fight COVID pandemic without fresh water, when one of the main prevention measures is washing your hands on a regular basis. Something similar happened with power. 2014, the interruption of the service was 21%. In 2019, that figure has skyrocketed to 83% without power in their houses. And it happens in every other example. I won't go to detail here. In the case of jobs, that has increased the contribution, not so much due to an issue of unemployment, but rather due to the loss of social security. And that dimension is jobs and social security. And the decrease, for instance, the people that have health insurance or health systems moved from 30%, they didn't have. She corrects herself. Yes, correctly. Now, currently, 90% of the population do not have any health insurance. And that has to do because the insurance makes no sense now for an insurance in Bolivar due to hyperinflation. And of course, again, that has to do with the fact that people basically is allocating most of the income to buy food, and they cannot afford anything else. So the decrease we see in education and housing, again, I would like to tell you that it's not an improvement of the situation, but rather that is the contribution to the synthetic indicator. We have 2 things, additional thing. Education doesn't change much, but the decrease in the case of housing, the government made a lot of propaganda with a program so-called Great Venezuelan Mission. And according to that, they have built more than 5 million housing, but in Venezuela, according to the projection, 8 million houses. Should that be true, of 5 million houses, the whole world would be living in houses that are not precarious in this country, but still the incidence in that sense remain quite high. According to ENCOVI, only 1.8% of the household declare that they have that they are in a house that they live due to the award of this so-called Misión Vivienda or housing mission. That was the propaganda of the government. According to food security, before pandemic, 93% of the household had some degree of food insecurity. And we used the Latin American and Caribbean scale of food security, ELSA is called. And as you notice, 93% of the household had certain degree, but of course, there are certain gaps regarding the social economic location where we see the distribution by quintiles. in spite of the fact that even in the richest quintile, we see remarkable levels of food insecurity, we can notice how a decrease and the degree also is lesser severe, and we have higher in the mild and moderate. So just to remind you, the scale of ELSA begins when the household declare that they have concerns in order to have food, all the food for the households. And then they begin to sacrifice the quality, the amount, etc. And begin, in many cases, to have strategies where the adults stop eating so as to favor the most vulnerable, which are the children and the elderly, until the situation becomes more severe. So making a calculation through ENCOVI, when we say that 68% of the population is under consumption poverty, it means that the average of the calorie intake of that population is below 2,000 calories per day. And for all that have done a diet, for a man, is to be on diet. So we're not talking about nutritional requirements that are too high, because the threshold of poverty are the minimum necessary usually. Of course, that has had a very remarkable impact in COVID and the measurement. In the children below 5 years. And the question is why you do in children below 5 years and not the same survey in the rest of the population. And that has to do not only in COVID, but even the international agencies. This population is measured usually due to the impact, long-lasting impact that will have in this population when they have a malnourishment. When we don't have neuronal, biological, motor development that is adequate, and also malnutrition at this age can have severe impact that cannot be reversed for those that suffer that. You can see the figures, only I will refer to the ones that have to do with malnutrition, that is the relationship between weight and height, only 46%, meaning 45% of the children are affected by malnutrition, either to malnutrition or risk, or overweight, obesity, or risk of overweight. But look, this is not that the children of highest deciles are fat. When you see the overweight and malnutrition, they are mainly also located in the poorest sectors as well, because that has to do with a strategy within the households to have a high intake of carbohydrates, few proteins. And since they don't have proteins and nutrients, of course, people have a lot of intake of carbohydrates and ends up generating overweight. And that is a form of malnutrition, public health and malnutrition. And when we see the ratio height and age, we see the effects. When we notice the chronic malnutrition is that the child stops growing, and that has to do precisely with the development that takes place at that ages and only at that age. Afterwards, we cannot do anything about it. We have certain data on the pandemic within the framework and using ENCOVI as a sampling framework. We had certain telephone surveys, and we asked which were the main issues that the household faced. In the first telephone survey, 43% of the household reported loss of jobs or income. When we saw those that were affected the most were the owners and the freelance workers, because those that depend from work of the public sector and private sector at the beginning of pandemic, they either the owners or the state wanted to retain the income for these employees. But in Venezuela, the category that is growing the most, that accounts for almost half of the population, is the freelance or independent workers. We have lost connection again. And those independent workers account for 45.3% in 2020. So with this labor market, the lockdown has severe impacts. The main problem that has been declared by the household is the increase of the food prices. And that problem was declared by the 70% of the household when we asked them before the lockdown. That problem was declared by 39% of the household before the lockdown. In June, we did again some telephone surveys, and we saw again, and here we see the most important impact, we have food insecurity that has increased to 97%. It moved from 93 to 97%. Close to 90% of the household showed a lot of concern due to the possibility of being without food. Close to 60% of the household, in fact, were not able to have enough supply in a given day of the month. And the number of households that stop having a healthy diet or with low variability of food remain about 80%. In 2020, 65% of the household reported to have adults eating less than what they really needed. And as I said before, that the adults protects usually vulnerable population, the children and the elderly. So this percentage increased to 90% after the pandemic began and the lockdown measures were established. As a final remark, yes, we don't have much time. Yes, that is my final remarks. I will read. Yes, very quick. The ENCOVI results reflect the impact of the crisis accumulated practically in all the spheres of the national life, not only an economic problem, it's a social and institutional and political problem. And the Secretary of OAS already knows that. The government politics or policies, instead of fighting that situation, have worsened this crisis, generating more inequalities. The two massive strategies, which are the black boxes, which are quite popular, are quite irregular, both in terms of content and timely fashion. And bonuses are quite linked to a record that is called ID of the motherland, and can have political impacts in terms of the people that receive that box of food. I'm sorry that I took so long. I'm not sure, but I cannot move. I cannot move and go to the next slide. Yes, we can hear you. Two final remarks. Yeah, the ENCOVI survey shows that these strategies have few possibilities in terms of the humanitarian crisis. Pandemics arrives in the country where we already have an emergency with problem, such as the shortage of fuels in a country that has a huge amount of reserves. Of course, we don't see in the short term any situation improvement. And as to the pandemic, at this time, we are having a peak of infections. And to the life standards, we have seen that the surveys after the lockdown things are getting worse. I would like only to say that we have to acknowledge that the country changed. Venezuela has lost its capacity to generate richness, and the social demands are reconfigured in terms of the social government that we have experienced. The issue is to the deficit that we will have new potential demands in terms of that changes. The extension of the crisis and the deepening as a consequence of pandemic can hinder even more the reversion of the situation that has been seen. And if we see the current regime of public policies, we will continue to see the deterioration of the social and economic situation of Venezuelans. We have seen that the initiatives, public policies have not been able to contain the deterioration, but they generate inequalities. Vis-a-vis the possibility of any change in the political direction of the country, it is necessary to have public policies, strategies that can address the extreme crisis, but assumes a new economic and social policies under which we have seen the country so far. Therefore, it is necessary, and that is my personal opinion, that I don't see any possibilities of leaving this crisis with the current regime. Thank you, and I apologize for all the promise of connection.
Thank you. We have around 20 or 25 minutes for questions, and we have a question for the General Secretariat on the different possibilities and scope. First of all, I would like to know if you still see negotiations between the government and the opposition. Do you see this as a possible way out for the political crisis in the country? There is another question on that same arena. Is it if a transitional government could be headed by people from the regime, as Lopez or Moreno? And your answer on the proposal to suspend the economic sanctions and also to improve the quality of life of people. Fourth, and a bit more polemic, what should happen so the international community decides to intervene military intervention in Venezuela? And what is the role of the OAS in such an intervention? Fifth, and another question, how should the motive or the impact of the human rights of the UN as external intervention in Venezuela be considered as an external intervention in Venezuela? If elections, regional elections, December this year, could they play a role? Could they play a role if there is a possibility for the next elections? I would like to leave it there and see if we have some answers, and then we can go for a second round of questions. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. They are quite broad. They include many areas. Negotiations between the dictatorship and the opposition. When we talk about the partial scope and when we are, as Jorge Rodriguez is constantly designing, Jorge Rodriguez is the real dictator of Venezuela. He is the instrumentalist, internal and externalist in the dictatorship in Venezuela. Negotiations happen permanently. Negotiations happen permanently, and taking the different actors, different actions taken, letting some to lift the sanctions out of the country, or making others participate in regional elections, or keep others away, co-opted through corruption, through threats, and of a judicial repressive character. So this is how dictatorship deals with the different actors. Negotiations never stop because this is part of the regime. It's part of the regime, and negotiations between transition government and dictatorship, as the dialogue table that we had and that were developed some time ago, they're definitely very difficult. They're very difficult because I like the metaphor someone made, saying that they're hijackers in a bank. They took the bank, and they have people retained, and they say, okay, you negotiate your liberation, you do it yourself with the with the kidnappers. So if you're kidnapped, you deal with the kidnapper, and that's it. But this is not so. This is a situation with dictatorship. It is a negotiation that is difficult. And it is in a very difficult level. It's in a difficult level in terms of equity is asymmetrical, and conditions are very difficult. So without a clear participation of the international community in fostering democratic solutions, in carrying forward all the democratic actors in Venezuela, it will be impossible. It will be impossible. So therefore, it's absolutely necessary to have a strategic unit of the international community. Now, going to the second question, please, I need to hear it again. If it's a transition government, yes, I got it. Yes. A transition government. Well, we wouldn't be facing a transition government because this is continuity of dictatorship. And Michael Moreno, also a continuity, and changing for nothing to change. So these are proposals that we're thinking about, and they're articulating, as Jorge Rodriguez has mentioned, and that might be offended because no one heard. And as a leadership of transition, and as Michael Moreno and Vladimir Padrino. So this is trying to show that there is a change without a change in reality, And sanction of a dictatorship and the corruption of dictatorship, and that was stolen from the Venezuelan people, the destruction of the social thread of the country. This is direct from dictatorship. So it's very difficult to think about the fact that dictators sanctioned and their appointees, they will take that money and they will take it to the Venezuelan people. They will return it to the Venezuelan people. That's ridiculous. It is the most absurd thing that we have ever heard. And the sanctions to PDVSA, well, we cannot ensure that the financial scheme of PDVSA was a scheme of money laundering in drug trafficking, corruption, and other activities. So if the schemes in different assets from Venezuela to buy humanitarian aid is clear, it's important, but that it does not imply lifting the sanctions. That possibility is open. for the dictatorship, but they're not interested in buying anything. They just want to recover their assets and recover financial mechanisms with which they did the money laundering. Sanction is still dictatorship, and dictatorship is still what is the bleeding that is supporting also the Cuban regime. I don't see any military intervention possibility right now. There is a lot in diplomacy, sorry, to do, and the international agenda. We need to generate spaces. We need to generate international spaces, put pressure to dictatorship, surround dictatorship, isolate dictatorship, and generate situations, political and diplomatic situations that would make things more convenient for them. Leaving power, leaving power more convenient for them than staying in power. That is the main objective. We don't see any conditions right now for a military intervention, not even remotely speaking, as it is suggested here. Regional elections on international intervention. The protection of human rights is an international issue, and this is part of, it's in the cover of the book. So protection, hemispheric protection, is also the A1 of the book. So if you open any book on international law and human rights, it's there, and it's contained in Article 1. And from the protection of human rights and democracy. And it is positive. It is positive. It is positive for the regime. It's a semi-inclusion system that will try to present this as a variable, a legitimation or legitimacy, external legitimacy, and they were not able to sell that before, so therefore it will be very difficult to sell that again. I don't see any conditions for this to happen, but yes, some will be noted because some need to continue with a certain party structure and two or three positions and that for their leaders. So these are things that we have always seen, because these people, they become collaborators. All dictatorships have had collaborators, and this is a scheme that repeats itself again. And this is quite cyclic, and collaborators, they come together depending on the needs of the regime. If the regime proposes that, it's because it benefits them. A brief follow-up. The efforts of the region in the OAS to collectively defend democracy in the region, how does it change with the change of administration in the United States? Positive steps under Biden's government? Yes, sure, for sure. This has been so in the first areas, an organization and organization. It has been positive, extremely positive, between the organization and the new administration of the United States. We have the missions to Guatemala, continuity of work, and the mission of Salvador, and also Article 17, positive work, and the logic of work in the organization has been maintained. The commitments, fundamental commitments, re-democratization, and also dictatorship in the hemisphere. They have maintained themselves with, and in this sense, what we need to do is to recognize the work of all those that are fighting dictatorship throughout the area. The authorities are telling us that we need to close, and they have to go back to work. And I would like to thank you all, especially Luis Almagro, the General Secretariat of the OAS, and María Gabriela Ponce, for your participation. And I have learned very much. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for the opportunity, and a big hug for all of you, and a great pleasure, Stephen. We will be meeting soon. Thank you so much. Great pleasure being with you, and great honor. Thank you for the possibility you're giving us. Thank you so much.